Last lesson, we looked at the going solo section and we learned how you can make your first ham radio transmission and contact. Today we're going to look at the repeater section. And to start off this section, I feel that it's appropriate to go over what a repeater is anyway. Well, a repeater is basically something that receives a ham radio signal on one frequency and then repeats what it hears with more power by transmitting it on another frequency. So we'll write that under this word repeater. Receives and then it transmits it again. It repeats it almost, which is why it's called a repeater. And you can see here, whoops, hold on, we're having some technical glitches with the easel. All right. Anyway, you can see here I've drawn we've drawn a diagram on the screen. So we have this repeater here in the middle in blue, and then we have two pickup trucks, pickup truck A and B. And this diagram is really going to help us explore repeaters and how repeaters work. So say that pickup truck A over on the left transmits a signal to the repeater. So the signal goes off its antenna and it hits the repeater just like that. Now what the repeater does is it takes that signal from pickup truck A and transmits it again over here on a different frequency with more power to pickup truck B. So it goes back from the repeater to pickup truck B. And that's why the system is called a repeater. It takes any signal it receives and repeats it on a different frequency. So the signal just went from pickup truck A into the repeater and out to pickup truck B. And pickup truck B can do the same thing. He can transmit through the repeater to pickup truck A. So basically the pickup trucks can talk to each other via this repeater, which is sort of like this middleman. Now why would you even want to do this though? Well, repeaters use a lot more power than your home radio when they retransmit a signal. So they're very useful for extending the range of your station. So even if the pickup trucks are really far apart and ordinarily they wouldn't be able to reach each other because their signals wouldn't be strong enough, they can hit the repeater. They can still talk to each other by hitting a repeater that's located in between them. Now over here, I also want to make a note of something. Repeater stations aren't the only types of stations that can retransmit radio signals in this way, although repeaters are the most common types. There's something else called auxiliary stations and even space stations. These can also automatically retransmit ham radio signals as well. Don't worry too much about what an auxiliary station is. If you really want to know, you can ask me a question on the website, but it's not really covered on the exam, so I'm not going to go over it here right now. But you want to take a note that auxiliary stations and space stations can retransmit signals because as of 2018, there are questions on the ham radio exam that talk about this. So repeaters, auxiliary stations, and space stations. Space stations, which is pretty cool, and we're going to look more at space stations in a later lesson. Anyway, one important thing you also have to know about repeaters is something called repeater offset. This is a very important term, repeater offset. And this is basically just the difference between a repeater's transmit and receive frequency. You see, repeaters generally listen and receive frequencies on one frequency. So they listen on one frequency, but then they retransmit the signals and they speak on a completely separate but nearby frequencies. So repeater offset is the difference between those transmit and receive frequencies. Okay. They normally don't use the same frequency for both transmitting and receiving because this could cause some issues. It's generally better for them. They work better if there's a transmit frequency and a receive frequency. So yeah, the difference between them is called the repeater offset. So when I first got my license, I didn't know about repeater offsets, and I transmitted and received on the same frequency. So when I transmitted, nobody could hear me because I wasn't transmitting on the frequency that the repeater was listening on. I was transmitting on the frequency that the repeater was transmitting on. But there's a separate transmit and receive frequency, so you really have to keep this thing about repeater offset in mind. The ham radio exam might also ask you what the offsets are for certain bands or frequencies. So you kind of have to memorize that the repeater offset in the 2-meter band is 600 kilohertz. 600 kilohertz. And you also have to memorize, likewise, on the 70 centimeter band, this offset is 5 megahertz. 5 megahertz. I used to have some tricks to remembering these, but they don't really apply to the new exam, so you kind of just have to memorize these numbers. Unfortunately, there isn't really an easy way to remember why this is exactly true. You could remember, yeah, there isn't really an easy way to remember these. I mean, one way you could possibly remember, I suppose, is 70 centimeters. There's a lot more space there on those bands. We have a lot more frequencies there, so that's why the offset's bigger there than on 2 meters. I guess that's one trick you could use to remember, but there's no real trick to remember the number 5 or the number 600. But I guess you could use that to remember that 70 centimeters, the offset is larger. All right, so now we know repeaters transmit and receive on different frequencies, repeater offset, but who decides what the exact transmit and receive frequencies are? And this turns out to be the job of someone called the frequency coordinator. And the frequency coordinator is selected by local amateur radio operators who own repeaters. They select a frequency coordinator. And the frequency coordinator's job, by definition, is to coordinate frequencies. That's why he's called a frequency coordinator. And this includes coordinating repeater, transmit, and receive frequencies. And again, that might be on your test. It is as of the time I'm recording this in 2018, which will be up to 2020. Okay, so now if repeaters weren't already hard enough with their different transmit and receive frequencies and offsets and everything, it turns out talking on a repeater is even more complicated than merely transmitting on the repeater's receive frequency. Usually you also have to set up your radio to transmit a special tone in order to access a repeater. So usually this is what we call a sub-audible tone, and what that means is it's not audible. You can't hear the tone with the naked ear. But anyway, what you do is you program your radio to transmit this sub-audible tone with the sound of your voice. And since it's sub-audible, nobody can hear the tone except for the repeater. Humans can't hear it, but the machines at the repeater can hear it. And what that is, it's almost like a key. So the repeater will only pick up your signal if it hears that tone transmitted with your signal. So when it hears that sub-audible tone, it will recognize it and allow your signal to pass through. And the reason we have this tone system in place is so that we make sure that people who are transmitting on the repeater are intentionally transmitting on the repeater. So say sometimes you might have a random person just go onto the repeater's receive frequency and start transmitting without realizing he's talking on the repeater. That could be potentially an issue. So instead, the repeaters require that you transmit this special tone. You program it into your radio. Then if they hear that tone, they know for sure that you're trying to talk to the repeater, and that's when they'll let your signal through. And if you don't have that tone and you transmit to the repeater, it'll assume that you're just accidentally transmitting on that frequency. It'll block your signal. It won't repeat it. So the bottom line is when you're transmitting to the repeater, you have to have this special tone that the repeater is looking for. It's almost like a key to unlock the repeater and let your signal go through. So there are several different types of tones a repeater may want. Usually they're just looking for what we call a CTCSS tone. So there's a picture of a key, and one type of key or tone is CTCSS. So we'll write that underneath the key. There's also other types of tones. This is less common, but there's also a DCS tone. It's less common, but you should still know about it. Some repeaters do still use it. And I know this sounds really technical and complicated, so if you're getting confused, really all this means is that repeaters just require a special tone to be transmitted by a radio in order to work. That's all there is to it. And this way, interfering signals without the right tone that accidentally wind up on the repeater's received frequency are not accepted by the repeater. And the most common is a CTCSS tone. If you don't transmit those tones, the repeater can't hear you. Now, I also want to note here, CTCSS, DCS, they're sub-audible. Again, you can't hear them with the naked ear. There are some tones on the test that are audible. There's a carrier squelch tone, there's a tone burst tone, and a DTMF tones. Those are not sub-audible tones. They're audible tones. So audible tones include carrier squelch, tone burst, and DTMF. In fact, DTMF is perfectly audible to the human ear. You can hear it very loudly. It can be very loud sometimes. It's actually, if you pick up a telephone and you start hitting numbers on the telephone, you know how it makes strange telephone noises. Those are DTMF tones, which you can completely hear. Anyway, I'm just mentioning that because there are some test questions that ask about that as of right now. Now, many times you might be able to hear the repeater just fine, but you might find the repeater can't hear you. It's not retransmitting your signals. And if you hear the repeater but cannot access it, you may be using the wrong CTCSS or DCS tone. That's why this is very important. It's also possible you're transmitting on the wrong frequency and you set your offset wrong. Again, remember repeater offset. You have to make sure your transmit and receive frequencies are set the right way. But how do you know, how can you possibly figure all this out when you're trying to connect to a repeater? How do you know where the receive frequency is, where the transmit frequency is, what the offset is, what kind of subaudible tones it needs? Well, don't worry. It's actually not that hard. The best way to find this information is to consult a repeater guide, which is almost like a phone book, I suppose. But it contains all sorts of information about the repeater, including it helps you find repeaters, and it tells you how to connect to repeaters, what kind of tones you need, where you should be transmitting it. It lays it out very simply. Repeater guides, like phone books, are available as books, and there's also free repeater guides on the internet. So make sure to consult a repeater guide. The internet's probably the best source for repeaters. I'm going to include a link to a repeater guide later on in this course. All right, so we're going to take a break here because this section is a little longer. So I'm going to stop here. I will see you in the next video where we will continue with this section on repeaters.